On October 8th, 1871, Chicago burned, and almost every American has heard that story. But the deadliest fire that night was not in Chicago. It was 250 miles north, in Wisconsin. The Peshtigo Fire killed at least 1,200 people, possibly twice that number, yet most Americans never learned its name. By sunset, smoke was thickening around the lumber town of Peshtigo. Peshtigo was a small community in northeastern Wisconsin, built around timber, mills, workshops, and the river. The town's economy depended on wood, and wood was almost everywhere people looked. There were sawmills, piles of lumber, wooden buildings, fences, barns, bridges, and waste left from logging. That alone did not make disaster inevitable, but the summer of 1871 had been unusually dry. For months, the upper Midwest had experienced warm weather, little rain, and increasingly dangerous fire conditions. By early October, smaller fires were already burning across parts of Wisconsin and neighboring states. People had lived with smoke for days, so another smoky evening did not immediately feel extraordinary. That familiarity may have been one of the most dangerous things about the night. Residents had seen fires before, and many believed they understood what a forest fire looked like. But the landscape around Peshtigo had been prepared for something far more violent. Logging crews had cut enormous amounts of timber and left branches, bark, stumps, and other debris behind. Farmers also used fire while clearing land, adding more small burns to an already dry region. The exact spark that began the Peshtigo disaster is still uncertain. What mattered more was how much fuel was waiting when powerful winds arrived. On October 8th, a strong autumn weather system moved across the central United States. It helped produce strong southwesterly winds across Wisconsin, where the ground and vegetation were already dangerously dry. Small fires that might normally have stayed manageable could now spread quickly and combine. As evening approached, people around Peshtigo noticed the wind becoming stronger and the smoke becoming heavier. Some residents had already been fighting scattered fires near farms, roads, and wooded areas. Others continued normal Sunday routines, hoping the long dry spell would finally end with rain. Instead, the wind began pushing fire toward the town. At first, the danger was something people could still imagine fighting with buckets, tools, and manpower. Then the conditions changed faster than the town could respond. Survivors later described a roar so powerful that voices became difficult to hear. The wind carried sparks, burning branches, and pieces of flaming material through the air. Fire did not simply move along the ground. Burning debris helped ignite new places ahead of it. The sky brightened, smoke closed around the streets, and familiar escape routes became difficult to see. People who had spent weeks living near fire suddenly realized this one was different. There was no modern emergency alert, no siren network, and no organized evacuation system. Families had only minutes to decide where to go and what, if anything, to take. Some people rushed home for possessions, believing they still had enough time. Others immediately ran toward the Peshtigo River, one of the few places that seemed survivable. Animals were running too, including horses, cattle, and wildlife driven toward the same narrow refuge. The streets became crowded with people and animals moving through smoke, heat, and flying debris. One of the most important eyewitnesses was a Catholic priest named Peter Pernin. He survived the disaster and later published a detailed account of what he had seen. His testimony became one of the main reasons historians can reconstruct that night in human terms. Pernin described a town overwhelmed so quickly that ordinary ideas about firefighting became almost meaningless. People reached the river and entered the water, sometimes still wearing only their night clothes. Some stood chest deep or neck deep, trying to keep their faces below the worst heat. Wet blankets and pieces of cloth offered protection for those lucky enough to have them. Even the river was not truly safe. Burning debris fell from above, smoke made breathing difficult, and terrified animals crowded into the water. People struggled to keep their footing while exhausted neighbors disappeared beneath the surface. Some survivors spent hours in the river while fire consumed nearly everything around them. The heat was intense enough to damage metal and destroy structures that residents had considered solid. Buildings collapsed, trees burned, and the town's familiar streets became a landscape of flame and smoke. A boarding house that people believed might offer shelter became a deadly trap. According to historical accounts, dozens of people who gathered there were killed when the building burned. The bridge across the river also became dangerous, as frightened residents tried to cross in both directions. Eventually, the bridge itself burned and fell. By then, there was no clear side of the river that looked safer. The fire had become a regional disaster, not simply a town fire. Communities outside Peshtigo were also being destroyed across northeastern Wisconsin and nearby areas. Families living on isolated farms faced the same wind with even fewer places to escape. The Kelly family became one example preserved in later accounts of how quickly people were separated. When the fire arrived, wind and smoke made it nearly impossible for family members to hear one another. They became divided while trying to escape, with parents and children moving in different directions. Some survived, while others were found dead the next day. Stories like theirs help explain why the final death toll can never be known exactly. Entire households disappeared, and some victims had recently arrived in the region without complete records. Modern estimates usually place the number of deaths between about 1,200 and 2,400. Roughly 800 people may have died in Peshtigo itself. That means the fire killed at least 4 times as many people as the Great Chicago Fire. Across the wider region, approximately 1.5 million acres were burned. When morning arrived, survivors climbed from the river and looked for a town that was barely recognizable. Homes, businesses, mills, barns, and personal possessions had been reduced to ruins. People wandered through the destruction, searching for family members, neighbors, food, and medical help. Many survivors had escaped with almost nothing except the clothes they were wearing. The scale of death created another terrible problem. There were too many victims to identify individually, and many bodies could not be recognized. A mass grave in Peshtigo would eventually become one of the lasting symbols of the disaster. Yet while northeastern Wisconsin was trying to understand what had happened, another city dominated the news. Chicago had also caught fire on the evening of October 8th. Its fire destroyed thousands of buildings, killed about 300 people, and left around 100,000 homeless. Chicago was already one of the most important and rapidly growing cities in the United States. Its business connections, newspapers, railroads, and national profile made the disaster impossible to ignore. Peshtigo had none of those advantages. It was a small lumber community, and the fire had damaged the very systems needed to spread news. Telegraph lines were burned, so information from the disaster moved slowly toward larger cities. Reports from Chicago reached the outside world faster and in far greater volume. By the time people elsewhere understood the scale of Peshtigo, Chicago had already captured national attention. That does not mean Americans deliberately chose to forget Wisconsin. It means memory often follows the places that already have the loudest voice. Chicago had recognizable landmarks, enormous economic importance, and a dramatic urban rebuilding story. It also gained a famous origin myth involving missers: O'Leary's cow and a kicked lantern. That story was later exposed as fabricated, and the true cause of the Chicago fire remains uncertain. But myths are powerful because they give people a simple image they can remember. Peshtigo had no single cow, lantern, or famous city skyline to carry its story forward. Even the cause of the Peshtigo Fire resists a simple explanation. Historians and weather researchers point instead to several conditions working together. Prolonged drought dried the landscape. Logging and land clearing left large amounts of fuel, while existing fires and powerful winds created conditions for extremely rapid spread. That explanation is less memorable than one careless person starting one enormous disaster. But it is more important because it shows how catastrophe can grow from ordinary risks stacking together. No single branch, spark, or gust explains what happened. The danger came from a whole landscape becoming vulnerable at the same time. Peshtigo also became part of a much larger pattern across the Midwest. Fires burned in Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and other areas during the same period. Hundreds more people died outside Peshtigo and Chicago. The region was experiencing a broad fire crisis, not two completely separate accidents. For survivors, however, the larger explanation could not change what October 8th had taken. Families were gone, farms were gone, businesses were gone, and entire communities had to rebuild. Relief eventually arrived from other parts of Wisconsin and beyond. Food, clothing, money, and supplies were collected for people who had lost almost everything. Peshtigo rebuilt, just as Chicago rebuilt. But the two disasters entered American memory in very different ways. One became a story taught in classrooms and repeated for generations. The other remained famous mainly in Wisconsin, fire history, and the records of those who survived it. Today, the Peshtigo Fire is still considered the deadliest fire in United States history. Its exact death toll remains uncertain because the destruction was simply too complete. That uncertainty should not make the event feel smaller. If anything, it reveals how completely the fire erased people who were never fully counted. The most disturbing part of Peshtigo is not that Americans remember Chicago. Chicago's disaster deserves to be remembered. The disturbing part is how easily an even deadlier event can disappear from national attention. History is not always a list of the biggest events. Sometimes it is a list of the events that were easiest to report, explain, and retell. On October 8, 1871, two famous fires burned on the same night. One became part of American mythology. The other killed far more people and nearly vanished from the national story. If you want more true stories America forgot and the darker history behind familiar events, subscribe to Timeless Histories, because some of the most important stories are the ones we stopped telling.